plants as well. And then I want to start talking about animals. And we'll see how far we get today in terms of talking about animals. We'll start kind of with a recognition that animals get energy different ways. And then we'll talk about this thing that really seems to dominate in certain types of adaptations across organisms, which is the surface area to volume ratio that you may have heard about, either in diffusion and osmosis, and lots of times in nutrient uptake, again, when we talk about digestive systems in places like biology too. And then we'll be able to talk about some specializations that we see in animals in terms of adaptations, things like adaptations for water loss and temperature regulation. Things, again, that seem to be really common themes across these different types of organisms. And along the way, hopefully we'll talk a little bit about different feeding adaptations. All these organisms eat radically different things, and their form really well fits the functionality of what they're trying to do in their ecosystem. And so that's a process, an endpoint of evolutionary adaptation. Okay, let's start here for today. So again, we're thinking about adaptations of plants for different light levels. And remember that they have to meet a minimum amount of light in order to meet their respiration needs. And so if they lower their respiration needs, they can need less light. At the same time, they can get too much light and they can actually be photoinhibited. And so for some plants, they don't do well in high light conditions. And each species is adapted then for a particular light regime that has, over evolutionary time, developed minimum and maximum light tolerances that then determine where it can grow, depending upon temperature, latitude, and moisture profiles. Okay, across broad categories of plants then, we see two kind of generalities in relationship to light tolerance. We see shade intolerant species, ones that are adapted for very high light conditions, like our prairie grasses. And then we see another category of plants that are shade tolerant. They do really well in low light shaded conditions. These are really common plants that we would find in the understory of a forest, particularly in places like a rainforest where there's just really dense canopy cover and there's very little light coming through. We see that the leaf structure, we see leaf shape, we see leaf angle, number of leaves varies between these two different groups of plants. And then we see some other stuff too. In particular, shade-tolerant plants tend to have a lower light saturation point. Okay, that means that they can take less light before they get too much light. Okay, they have a lower maximum light limit to them. Okay. And they have a lower maximum rate of photosynthesis. They will top out quicker than a shade intolerant high light adapted species. Okay. So not only are they adapted to low light conditions, they'll more quickly encounter high light conditions that are bad for them. Okay. They are shade tolerant, they're like high light intolerant. The reason that they have a lower light saturation point and a lower maximum rate of photosynthesis is that they have a lower concentration of rubisco, one of the really important proteins in the photosynthetic process, in their cells. And with lower rubisco levels, it means that your respiration is less, and so you can live in lower light conditions. That's how they get their shade tolerance, because they have less rubisco, which means they have a lower metabolic respiration need to make less protein, so they can do less photosynthesis, they can do with less light. But this then limits their ability to photosynthesize and grow in high light conditions. Because they have less rubisco, you can add more light and it doesn't matter. Okay, it's not like they're going to do more photosynthesis because they don't have the rubisco protein to do it anyways, and they aren't going to start making it. And that means they'll top out sooner in terms of maximum photosynthetic rate because they have less rubisco to do photosynthesis, and they'll top out sooner in terms of photoinhibition and maximum light levels. So it's a trade-off. They do better in low light conditions because they have lower radiation need, but they won't grow really well in high light conditions. Okay, here we're looking at some shade tolerant species. And we have some, or I should say, shade intolerant species and some shade tolerant species over here. Again, we can see that the shade tolerant species have a lower maximum photosynthetic rate. They have less leaf respiration though, and as a result of that, they grow a little bit more slowly than the highlight species, the shade intolerant. Okay, there's the trade-off. You can live, but not as well. Okay, all right. The shade intolerant species, then these highlight adapted species, their trade-off is that they win competition in the sun. Okay, when there's lots of light, they're going to do well, they're going to grow faster, they're going to photosynthesize more, they're going to be the best competitor in that particular condition. Their trade-off is they can't live in the shade. Okay, they have too high a respiration rate, they need too much photosynthesis, that when light levels get really low, they can't live there. That opens up a niche then. That opens up a habitat where the shade tolerant species can do really well. The shade tolerant species can grow in the shade and they can grow in the sun, but they're going to grow less slowly. They're going to do worse in the sun in the highlight environments. They're going to get outcompeted by the highlight adapted species in the sunlight. And that's exactly what happens. You see shade tolerant species living in the understory, and as they start to grade out into the open glades in the forest, or they start to butt up against the deserts and the prairie lands, they start to decrease in abundance because they're outcompeted by the shade intolerant species.
Are the shade tolerant species kind of like dependent on the shade intolerant species in a lot of cases? Do they provide like that canopy or?
Yes, yeah, and thinking about it that way, you definitely can think of it to some extent like that. You won't even create the habitat for the shade tolerant species, essentially, if you don't have that canopy layer, if you don't have some vertical structure to the plant community. It's kind of a toss-up whether or not trees are what we would consider shade intolerant species.
Yeah.
Because they have portions of their canopy that get highlight, and then they have portions of their canopy that receive lower light conditions. And so they're playing this interesting game on a different time scale than these more faster growing species.
Okay, so it doesn't apply for trees.
Yeah, but again, in trees, you'll still see it to some extent that a little bit like our zoologist last Thursday mentioned that you can't even get certain tree species to grow in forest unless they're shaded as juveniles and then allowed to grow up. And we'll see in community succession that the forest changes from these fast-growing, highlight adapted tree species into these longer-lived, more shade-tolerant, intolerant canopy hardwoods that we see later. That's a good question. I think. Okay. Again, we're looking here at seedling height of some different organisms. If you kind of grow them over time, either in the sun or in the shade, these guys, they'll grow, okay? These guys that are highlight adapted won't grow in low light conditions. They'll peter out, okay? They have to have highlight conditions. But for these guys that are like the shade tolerant ones, even if you give them lots of sun, they don't grow a whole lot different than they did in the shade. There's a trade-off here. Everybody feels good? Sorry. Okay, all right. This gives us to start thinking about some leaf specializations or some places that have interesting kind of either habitats or ecological niches that plants can start to fill. And the desert is one of these locations where we see lots of very specific plant adaptations for that particular environment. And so cacti, of course, are these plants that have evolved to have spines for leaves. And these are very highly modified, even in comparison to the needles of conifer trees, of our evergreens. And these leaves are really adapted so that they reduce water loss. This is a really high light, high evaporation environment. And they're balancing not necessarily for photosynthesis and maximum energy production, they're balancing for extreme water loss. And so in order to minimize that moisture loss, they've gotten these really modified leaves. Okay, it also helps out with defense. That's always a good thing. when you can adapt for two things at the same time. There's over 1,700 different species of cacti. We don't even consider the spines true leaves since they're not the photosynthetic part of the plant. That's all done in the modified stem here. And they do a special form of photosynthesis that we'll kind of run into again in a couple slides called PAM photosynthesis. And so they don't even try to fix carbon during the day. They don't even try to open their stomata during the day. They do it at night, all their carbon fixation, so that when they're open their stomata, those little leaf pores, they really have reduced moisture loss at the same time that they're bringing in carbon dioxide. And as a result, they really prefer to grow in dry, desert, drought-prone biomes, and they don't do well if you give them lots of water. If you grow them in houses, you got to put them in a sunny windowsill. You got to be really actually careful about how much water you give them. I can't tell you how many times my kids have picked up a cactus at the grocery store and I've been like, fine, whatever, and I have overwatered it to death.
You killed a cactus?
Yeah, I've killed cactus. It's pretty bad. You've been knowing what I know. I still overwatered the cactus. And that's a unique adaptation. That means that they're going to do really well and outcompete other species in these types of ecosystems. They can't live in other types of ecosystems. Their tolerances and their specificity has found them a specialized niche, but it excludes them from other places. That's their trade-off. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some water adaptations that we see in plants. So we said one of the challenges for terrestrial plants is that they have to have access to water. And they need it for photosynthesis, and they also need it in order to fuel respiration and to move materials around their bodies to help moderate temperature. All the stuff that water does, they have to have access to it. It's very different in aquatic plants that are surrounded in water. They don't have the same type of challenge. Definitely, we see that there's some phenotypic plasticity and acclimation that can happen in individual plants as they encounter different conditions. Over the course of a day, an individual plant can open and close its stomata in order to control for evaporation and water loss. And given highlight drought conditions, they'll become very adapted at closing their stomata and opening them less often during the day to meet those conditions. If it gets really bad, we'll start to see what's happening with lots of our trees and annual plants right now is that we have leaf wilting and leaf curling. That they'll actually decide to let go of leaves in order to preserve moisture in the major portion of the body. They can also alter leaf area. They'll grow smaller leaves given dry conditions because they're trying to conserve water resources. Not because there's less carbon dioxide or nutrients potentially, but because they know that this is a water loss liability. And of course, a plant can alter its ratio of growth in the kind of shoots to roots ratio. And again, they have less leaves when there's less water. You'll get a lower ratio of shoots to roots when water availability is low. And this might happen, for chance, say, in a tree or an orchard that you're working in, that if you do have drought conditions kind of year after year, you'll notice that the way that the tree is growing is radically different than in high rainfall, very wet conditions. And again, high moisture comes with its own problems in terms of fungal infections, bacterial infections, kind of popping and overwatering of cells. Like I did. Okay, here we're looking at kind of water supply increasing as we go in mils per day. Again, notice that the more water there is, the more they allocate to their leaves. Their kind of surface area ratio increases. They can have bigger leaves when you give them more water. And their kind of roots to the leaf area index, again, it kind of it goes down the more water that you have. You have, in this case, I got this flipped in terms of roots to shoots. So you have more in your shoots and less in your roots when you have enough water to support lots of leaves and shoots. We also see that plants can have some true evolutionary adaptations to water loss. And the one that has popped up several times in different major lineages of plants is that they do C4 and CAM photosynthesis rather than the traditional C3 photosynthesis. And in both of these processes, they're adapted in order to reduce daytime water loss. And that the idea that by choosing a slightly different pathway for carbon fixation, of turning that photosynthetic energy into organic matter, the plant can spend more time during the day with its stomata closed. And in doing so, they have become adapted to low water conditions, high evaporation rates, high temperatures. And so we see that C4 pathways for photosynthesis and can photosynthesis, like in the cacti, tend to pop up more in plants that live in drought-prone or high-temperature environments, like deserts. In the case of CAM photosynthesis, they do carbon fixation at night so that they only need to have their stomata open to get in carbon dioxide during the portion of the day when the evaporation rate is less. In the case of the C4 plants, they do their carbon fixation and their photosynthesis in different cells within the leaf structure. And in this way, again, they can be photosynthesizing during the day, but they don't have to have their stomata open to get in carbon dioxide. They can wait with that until they're ready to do so, whether that's the next day after it's rained or during the night. And so in those two ways, they have adapted to being able to live with their stomata closed more frequently. All right. We also see that over evolutionary timescales, plants that are in drought-prone conditions or low moisture areas tend to have more root mass compared to shoots. And that means there's less chance of loss of water in the shoots, but it's really an evolutionary adaptation to expand the area with more roots in which we can gain access to water, to increase surface area to volume ratio for water uptake. And so lots of times these plants in drought-prone conditions or in desert habitats have these really extensive root systems underground, even though there's this little plant on the surface, because they are really trying to push out and gain access to as much of the soil strata as possible so they get access to as much moisture as possible. And that way they outcompete other plants for access to moisture that would have a shallower or less expansive root system. We see that in these two charts that we have here. We have increasing precipitation as we go across the x-axis. And as you increase that, you get into the forest kind of woodland area. And on the far side, you're in the kind of shrub grassland area of lower precipitation rates. And again, notice that you get a higher ratio of roots to shoots, the less precipitation you have. Okay, the more precipitation, the less you need to put into roots, and the more you can actually put into shoots. Okay, other things we see as evolutionary adaptations is plants, again, that purposefully shed their leaves in dry seasons. And this is more common in tropical latitudes when you have a rainy, wet season and a dry season. And it may be summertime when it's dry and maximum sunlight, and that's actually when they go into dormancy and shed their leaves. It's kind of the opposite than what we have in our deciduous trees here that have their leaves out during the summertime when the light is fast. And then we see these specialized storage leaves and stems that help them to store water. And that's going to be our highlighted kind of plant here, which are the succulents, which are really popular in indoor kind of garden keeping these days. They're really nice indoor plants because you don't have to water them very frequently because they're adapted for low water moisture conditions. And they store a lot of moisture in their stems and leaves, actually, in order to tide them over times of desertification or drought. So those are the succulents. Definitely lots of our types of cacti fall into this kind of succulent category. But instead of storing lots of water underground, they actually have specialized storage chambers or structures in their stems, which allow for water storage. And in some of the cases of these plants, you can, in drought conditions, actually bore a hole into the stem and get liquid water out. And that's what some animals in these ecosystems do. And that's where the spines, again, are leaf adaptations to avoid those types of water predators that are interested in not only kind of the carbohydrate part of the plant, but they're interested in the water content of the plant. You might like to know that I've killed succulent plants as well.
Too much water again?
think the take-home message is shouldn't give me house. I do okay with those things, but
Much love.
yeah, I don't know what it is. I killed all my carnivorous plants too. There could be a lot of variety for that.
Did you say carnivorous plants?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
My kids, 2 years ago, the kids got real interested in carnivorous plants, which I'll talk about here in a couple slides too. And so we got some Venus flytraps, and they just like never took off. Like I think I had them for like 8 or 9 months, and then they just like wilted and died. And I mean, like I caught flies and gave them to them. I had them in the special soil, and I watered them, didn't water and water. It was too bad. Because they're fun. All right, the last plant adaptation I do want to talk about is nutrients, and that's where the carnivorous plants come in because they get nutrients in an interesting way. But of course, nutrient concentrations affect whether or not a plant is going to be able to grow roots versus shoots, or roots and shoots in general.
What is a shoot?
It's the leaf and the stem.
Okay, so
That's the like generalization that we're making. And again, in some plants, you're going to see that they're going to, when we talk about shoots, they're going to grow bigger stems, taller stems, and in other plants, they're going to put out more leaves. It just varies on the species. But this generality of this ratio seems to hold true for both moisture availability as well as for nutrients. That the more moisture you have, they'll tend towards more shoot production than roots. And if they're deprived of moisture, the ratio will flip and you'll get more in the root system. It's the same is true for nutrients in terms of roots versus shoots. The more nutrients they have, the more shoots they will grow, the more leaves and stems. But if you deprive them of nutrients, they will enhance their root structure. And so why would these plants grow more roots when they are nutrient deprived? And again, we're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus.
Because they're just looking for deposits of nutrients in the soil because it's not coming from above.
Yeah, exactly. Just like with water, they're expanding their root structure in hopes that they can encounter more nutrients underground. Because remember, it's the root system that takes up moisture and nutrients. And so that's what they're after. Is that an adaptation or an acclimation? Why do you think so?
Oh, I guess it's not temporary, right? It doesn't stay there forever. Well, I feel like it's not inherited, right? It's just kind of like, oh, I need to change something that's happening.
Right, yeah. And so you're, like, think about it a little bit more. Does anybody want to add to this?
Yeah, I didn't have a very good.
Throw it out there. No, you're right there. I mean, like I think you have it, but the point I want to make here is a little bit.
Oh, it's like they're changing based on a temporary part of, like a temporary change in their environment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they're adapting to the acclimating.
Right.
Due to a lack of nutrients or whatever.
Right. They're acclimating to the current conditions by putting more growth into roots. Their capacity to put more growth into roots is an adaptive trait. And some species are going to be able to acclimate more easily than other species. Some species don't have this ability, okay? And they won't be able to do it, and they'll die in low nutrient and low water conditions. Other species have the adaptation that they can acclimate to low nutrient and low water conditions, and they're the ones that will live in those types of situations. And so it's an acclimation on an individual organism, unique situation, time frame, and kind of geographic scale. But that individual's ability to acclimate is an adaptive inherited trait. And each species has a different kind of acclimation window that's possible based on their genetics, based on what other pressures are selecting forces in their particular environments and interactions. Okay, again, the graph here is showing you changes in one species that's grown under different relative nutrient concentrations. And so more nutrients versus less nutrients. And you see it puts way more into roots when there's low nutrient conditions than when there are higher nutrient conditions. Okay. Nutrient adaptations, and again, just like for light adaptations, there's a trade-off when we have more roots and less shoots. And that if you're going to be adapted to really low nutrient or low moisture conditions, you often have a slower overall growth rate. And it can actually limit the maximum rate at which you can grow. So you can live anywhere because you can live under low nutrient conditions, but you grow really slow. And so under high nutrient conditions, you'll be outcompeted for those resources by the fast growing organisms. It's very similar to the trade-offs with light, that if you're adapted for low light conditions, you can grow anywhere, but in high nutrient conditions, high light conditions, you'll be outcompeted by those species that are best adapted for those conditions. Okay. So low nutrient tolerance limits your maximum growth rate. And that's what's happening in these two species that we have on our graph here. We're increasing nitrogen availability. This guy can live at lower nitrogen levels, okay? But he just can't grow as fast. Even if you give him lots of nitrogen, it doesn't change his overall growth rate eventually. This guy can't grow quite as low in terms of nitrogen concentration, but he'll keep growing and growing and growing faster and faster the more nutrients you give. The idea here for these plants is that by having a slower growth rate, they need less nutrients. They can exist on a lower nutrient flux rate and a lower nutrient concentration. But it means they're always going to grow slow, even if you give them lots of nutrients. The other interesting thing that seems to be a trend in nutrients in plant adaptations, is that those plants that are adapted for low nutrient conditions tend to have lower concentrations of nitrogen in their leaves, and they tend to hold on to their leaves for a longer period of time. That leaf that they grow stays with them all season. Yeah, you can think of it that way. And some conifers have really interesting soil conditions in which they do really well, and they tend to do well in places that have some of these strange conditions because they're adapted for that. Okay. And so in low nutrient tolerant species, they tend to have less nitrogen in their leaves and longer lasting leaves. Why? Why would that be advantageous to have less nitrogen in your leaves and to hang on to your leaves longer? Why don't you talk to your neighbor?
They can live longer.
Like a plant
Yeah. Well, they can build up and over a while.
Cool. What do you think?
Preservation.
Yeah.
Steady, like you're saying.
Yeah, and why is that good if you're a nutrient tolerant species?
Survive in all kinds of climates for all kinds of environments, I guess.
Yeah. The idea is that, what do you think, Cindy?
Madison.
Yeah. Well, you won't be out the competition, you'll outlast the competition.
Under what conditions?
A lack of nutrients.
The lack of nutrient conditions, okay? By having less nitrogen in your leaves, you need less nitrogen. So you can exist for longer in a place that has low nitrogen concentrations. If you hang on to your leaf longer, you don't have to grow a new leaf and allocate nutrient resources into leaf growing. Okay? Your leaf, it can last you longer. And that means that you need less nutrients on the front end to maintain your body. And that's really advantageous if you've got limited amounts of nutrients to begin with. If you need less nitrogen, and you need less phosphorus, you're going to do better there. Again, in the top graph, we can see that the longer lasting the leaf lifespan in months. I mean, like 100 months, that's like 5 years you hang on to a leaf. That's pretty cool. Or more than that, even. Thank you. I only go to 60. They have less nitrogen in each leaf. The trade-off is that those longer lasting leaves with less nitrogen photosynthesize less. Okay, so your growth rate is going to be slower. And that's what the bottom graph shows you, that those longer lasting leaves do less photosynthesis. And so if nutrients suddenly become available, you're at risk of being outcompeted by a species that can take in those nutrients and put them into faster growth and overtop you or push you out of the area in which you are. But if your conditions are constantly like this, that you're nutrient limited, then these adaptations are excellent. And it means that you can live there when other species can't. When we're looking at kind of really interesting ways of what we call phytoremediation, when we're looking at plants that are going to take up toxic compounds out of the soil and store them in their bodies, and then let us take those plants and put them in a more secure location to clean up land, we're looking for these types of nutrient adapted species very often because they're the only ones that can grow in those kind of crazy high middle, low nutrient, very acidic or basic soil conditions. And then they're going to hang on to those leaves and allow us to collect them and be able to dispose of that toxin in a reasonable fashion and clean up that area and remediate it. Okay, cool. All right, so we see some interesting root and stem adaptations and leaf adaptations for low nutrient environments and conditions, or even just for nutrient storage in general. And so we eat lots of different storage roots as ourselves as omnivores. Storage roots, like in the case of the radish and the carrots and the beets and the turnips that we see here, they're storing food and water in these underground root structures. And for their purposes, that's what they're going to grow from the next year. That's what they're going to turn into flowers and seeds in coming generations. For us, that's a key source of nutrition for the human diet, both in terms of starches and carbohydrates, as well as vitamins. So you can have a storage root, which are classic root vegetables. It's always nice to remind yourself sometimes what exactly it is that you're eating. In the case of a carrot, there are other plants that store food and water in their shoot systems, and these are called tubers. And although we often associate them with the root systems of plants, they're actually underground stems, and the ends lots of times of rhizomes and stolons, which are types of shoots that extend out from a main plant in order to store water and nutrients for the growing plant. What's interesting about the eyes of tubers, like in potatoes and yams, is that each little eye is a cluster of auxiliary buds that can regrow into the entire plant. You can snip it off and put it back into the appropriate conditions. And so it's really interesting in plants and how they grow. The fact that they retain totipotent cells throughout their life cycle, and that at certain locations in their bodies, they have these totipotent cells that have the retaining capacity to turn into anything in terms of cell specialization. And that's very different than the growth structure and maturity that we see in multicellular animals, where totipotent cells are an ephemeral part of their really early embryonic stages, and then everything specializes.
The potatoes and the yams are the eyes of the tubers?
Well, the potato and the yam is the vegetable that we eat, but it's actually a stem. It's not a root. Yeah. And as such, it has these little stem buds on it, which are the eyes.
Oh.
That can regrow into the whole
plant. I have to leave a bunch of potatoes under your sink forever and then start shooting up.
That's why.
Yeah,
that's why all of a sudden you have leaves in your leftover potatoes. Yeah. There was one time when I was in college and my roommate and I moved houses. We had we went from 4 roommates to 2 roommates. So we were the last ones that moved out, so we took everybody's leftover stuff with us. And we had taken with us and moved somehow a bag of potatoes. And we just left it in a cupboard.
Yeah.
And 9 months later, we were like, what is that god awful smell?
Oh, yeah.
And we looked and we had made vodka out of these potatoes sitting in our cupboard for 9 months. We had gone past the shoot and reap stage and directly to decomposition. It was what? And of course, we're both very conscientious people, and we were like, what could we possibly have that would be rotting? And it was because it wasn't us, it was an old roommate's potato. We had brought this again because we're conscientious. Okay, all right. The last type of kind of plant I want to tell you about then are these carnivorous plants, and they're these nutrient specialists, in that they have modified their leaves to be able to trap and digest animals and protozoans, and in some cases, bacteria as well, for nutrient excess. They're getting from it not only organic matter, so that they can photosynthesize less, but they're also getting nitrogen and phosphorus and silicon and sodium and magnesium, all the stuff that they have a hard time getting out of the soil. This happens to be one of these guys that has kind of this sundew-like entrapping mechanism. They have little bits of sweet nectar that come out on these little spines, and the insects approach and start to eat, and then they become entrapped in the liquid, and the leaf curls around them, and the plant digests it. Which is way cool, because we don't think of plants as eating stuff, but they don't, except when you're a carnivorous plant. It turns out that most of these types of carnivorous plants live in places where nutrients are scarce. And they tend to live in highly waterlogged and acidic soils, where decomposition sometimes does not take place. So nutrient regeneration is very, very slow. So they live in places like bogs and wetlands, and they often live on rocky substrates. They're some of the first plants that can colonize. Again, places that don't have a soil structure that promotes nutrient regeneration and access to nutrients. I think it's pretty phenomenal that carnivorian plants has evolved 9 times across 5 different orders of plants. It's not one plant ancestor that has produced the diversity of carnivorous plants that we have today. It's actually something that is so adaptive that when it appears in a group of plants, it sticks. And that the adaptive trait that it provides, of course, is that you can live in conditions that other plants can't. You can be the only one out there. The side effect, the trade-off, is that the conditions you live in are so poor that you have to be carnivorous in order to live there. That your autotrophy and your root system isn't going to get you everything that you need.
These plants, they still photosynthesize.
They do, yeah, they do. And for most of them, they can support themselves with photosynthesis, but they need the extra input of the nutrients and organic matter from eating something to be able to produce new leaves and sometimes to reproduce a flower.
So can they survive in nutrient-rich soil, or are they rejected?
They grow well, but then they grow slow. They get a maximum,
Yeah, so it doesn't.
and they'll
Okay,
never
gotcha.
go crazy because they're limited by what they have to do.
Okay.
For lots of these guys, they have a pretty bad root structure too,
Sense.
and that lots of times they're plants that live on other plants. They're epiphytes. The carnivorous plants that we have that have these little itty bitty roots, and I could never get them to latch on to the stuff. And that just really indicates the difference between root and shoot allocation, and that they've got to have it right in the shoots because the roots aren't going to be able to provide it. Just some other types of new carnivorous plants that we see. These are definitely the pitfall traps, the pitcher plants. Come in all kinds of really beautiful colors and shapes. They eat stuff, and then there are a whole host and community of invertebrate organisms that live in the pitcher plant ecosystem itself, either in the aquatic system, or they also live around the rim and eat the insects that are drawn to the nectar that's produced. These are the flypapery guys, where the whole leaf is covered with little dots of nectar that then act like glue to trap the insects. The insects here are digested right on the leaf surface. They'll emit their hydrolytic enzymes right through the leaf surface as well. And then the snap traps, like in the Venus flytrap, where here you have the little spines and hairs that when the insect rubs against them, trigger the leaf to snap shut like a little trap, and then they digest them inside their little leaf trap. Usually the zoo, and the Cincinnati Zoo definitely is true, this lots of times in different displays that they have for the animals, they'll have sprinkled in some of these cool carnivorous plants for you to take a look at too. Here in our area, we definitely have certain types of pitcher plants as well as the snap traps that grow in our wetland ecosystems that in Ohio are really endangered because we tend to drain our wetland ecosystems, either agriculture or urban development. Any questions or comments about plants?
Did you see that Planet Earth thing where they have like the snap trap and then like a slug kind of like gets stuck in it and then there's like a tiny little hole and then he squeezes his body like through the hole?
Oh, I don't think I've seen that part. Oh, that's awesome. I haven't watched all of Planet Earth 2 yet. It's like a tragedy. I know my
Are there big carnivorous plants like in Ice Age?
in Ice
Maybe
Age.
once.
So I think they're on one or more of these. But when these guys grow in the tropics, or they grow in somebody's garden where they're well taken care of, it's not uncommon for a mouse or a small bird to fall in and be eaten.
Like, I didn't know if they're all just like insect size.
No, some of them can take small mammals and birds too.
Are you worried for your personal safety?
I was gonna say, they're not human sized, but they can.
Sorry.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Both for plants and animals, it turns out that the surface area to volume ratio is pretty important for maintaining body size and getting nutrients and water and dissolved gases in and wastes and dissolved gases out of the organism. And so this is what we call the SA to V ratio. And the kind of interesting thing that happens is that as an organism gets bigger, in volume as well as kind of in circumference. And again, we can think of a sphere or a cube, but we know that organisms are oddly shaped, and sometimes the odd shape is because they're trying to deal with surface area to volume ratio, actually. As the organism gets bigger in volume, its surface area increases by a squaring factor, right? We take the surface area of a square or a cube, we're squaring. But the volume of that same organism increases by a factor of a cubic ratio, okay? And so that's a big difference. It means that as the organism gets bigger, its volume increases much faster than its surface area does. And when you're small, it's not such a big difference. But as you start to get big, and it doesn't take much to start getting really big, it means that you have a ton of volume inside you that has to be serviced by an ever shrinking amount of surface area in ratio to how much volume you have. And so that puts a limit on how much volume can be serviced by a given amount of surface area on the outside in terms of dissolving stuff in or eating stuff or getting rid of waste and expelling. And the problem here is that the surface area to volume ratio goes down as your size increases. And so here in the example from our textbook, we're looking at cubes of different lengths on their sides. And you can see that as the surface area kind of goes up as we increase length, but the volume starts to go up exponentially. And the result of this in surface area divided by volume then is that when you're small, you have a really high surface area to volume ratio. There's a ton of outside stuff in comparison to what's inside. But before long, this ratio starts to go down towards 1 and even under 1. And that means that for every unit of volume, there's only 1 unit of surface area, or perhaps less, in order to deal with your waste and to get in all your nutrients and stuff. And this often places a limit then on the maximum size that organisms can reach, or it means that they have to start adapting for a decreased surface area to volume ratio. Okay. The thing that tends to happen with organisms, again, both plants and animals, although we're moving into talking about animals, is that as you get bigger in size, your metabolic needs increase. You need more stuff, and you're going to be making more waste. But at the same time that you're getting bigger and that you're needing more and you're producing more, your surface area that does those processes of getting you more and getting rid of your waste gets less. And so this means that organisms either have to adapt or they get outcompeted. And it means that organisms that are smaller tend to have an advantage. They need less resources because they have a reduced metabolic need and they have a better surface area to volume ratio in which to get those resources in and out. And so things like microorganisms do better than larger organisms when it comes to accessing resources and water and expelling waste. Okay? Like, this is one of the underlying reasons why there's a trillion bacteria for every one of us. This surface area to volume ratio then really influences the outcome of competition for resources. And in aquatic ecosystems, it plays a big role in buoyancy. And that if you're smaller, you need less and you can get it better than if you're bigger. In terms of buoyancy, if your surface area to volume ratio is low, you'll sink. And if you're a phytoplankton, that's bad if you sink out of the light. Okay? And so they tend to increase surface area to volume ratio in order to remain in the water columns where conditions are best for that organism. The final thing that surface area to volume tends to influence is that it limits cell size. Okay? There is no organism on Earth that is a giant cell walking around inherently because of surface area to volume ratio problems. And instead, what we see are multicellular organisms with lots of small cells with good surface area to volume ratios that work together. Okay. The way I always think about it is that possums are made up of lots of little cells rather than being one giant possum cell due to surface area to volume. Okay. There's lots of other advantages to being multicellular, but one of them is that it preserves a good surface area to volume. Okay, thinking about this, and knowing that one way to do this is to divide cells and have lots of cells working together, one solution to this problem. What are some other solutions that you know of that organisms employ to solve the surface area to volume ratio? And again, you could talk to your neighbor. What do organisms do in order to increase surface area compared to their volume? What do you think? It's an excellent time to talk to each other. What do you think would help get you more surface area?
Size more volume. Shapes, circles.
Good. Think about that. Think about the idea of shapes. What shapes would be best for surface area to volume?
Circles, ovals, more than squares or triangles.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. What else? Given one shape and one kind of internal volume, how could you enhance surface area given that same volume?
Round your edges.
What was that? Round your edges? What are you thinking of when you say that?
More closer just to a circle, the more surface area you have, right?
But think about how, even if you had a circle, how could you enhance surface area on that circle? No, we don't want to make the volume any bigger. Given that one kind of static sphere, how could you give it more surface area?
Make it thinner.
Make a cylinder.
Good. And make a cylinder.
Over.
Yeah, and not only make it like a cylinder, but make it like a tunnel, right?
Mhm.
So you can have surface area on the
Oh,
inside and surface
Ooh.
area on the outside.
Oh.
Think about your digestive system, or like a stem, yeah. What else? What are some other things that your body does or that cell organelles do in order to enhance surface area?
Mhm.
Cells are really tiny. There's,
Yeah, but even think about like the internal structure of like the chloroplast and mitochondria. Like the little structure of your digestive tract. What's special about those little cells?
Mm.
You like to have.
what was the question? What's special about our digestive tract?
Yeah, so we know we have this tube digestive system, gives us lots of surface areas we're going through the tube to exchange. But on each individual little cell of your digestive system, what is special about it in terms of surface area?
Mm.
They're made.
We're at a loss today. Your veins are
Five out.
brains are big. Each of the cells of your digestive system is covered in these little hair-like extensions that increase surface area for absorption of materials. And so cell extensions, infolding, folded membranes, cilia, villi, little bumps on the surface of stuff, all of that increases surface area, but it doesn't necessarily change volume. And so that bumps up the surface area to volume ratio. And so we see this across all kinds of organisms, that they get all these cell extrusions and extensions, or they have all these little limbs and tentacles in order to increase surface area to do all these jobs. Of course, in the case of these tube worms, they have this big digestive system and these homes where water comes in and out in this tunnel again in order to enhance surface area for the water to be moving across these organisms. And those two things we're going to see time and time again. How does a plant get more access to light and carbon dioxide? It makes more leaves, which have a huge surface area in which to exchange materials. They're very thin, and lots of times you can do stuff on both sides. So that infolding, that increasing in texture, we see it all the time in types of phytoplankton and zooplankton. They have all these kind of crazy shell extensions to enhance surface area, so they hang like little umbrellas in the water column for buoyancy rather than sinking out. Okay, cool. Okay, in animals, and to some extent in plants too, many of their adaptations, many of the interactions that we're going to see between them and each other, as well as mostly their environment, are aimed at maintaining homeostasis. And we'll come back to this idea of homeostasis in a few different times throughout the semester. Here's our first kind of look at it, and then when we talk about energy flows, we'll think about this again. And this idea that for any organism, they want to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. And sometimes that's going to be the same as their environment in terms of temperature or salinity or oxygen concentrations. And sometimes it's going to be really different from their environment on these same types of factors. So they want to have this internal environment when it comes to things like oxygen and carbon dioxide, temperature, salinity, waste concentration, nutrients. And again, we see that there are some common classes of solutions to this homeostasis problem. And in animals, we're going to look at it probably in terms of salinity today and osmotic pressure, and we'll see if we get to the temperatures. Okay, so in terms of homeostasis, we see there are going to be these two categories of organisms. You can be a conformer, or you can be a rigorous. And conforming organisms have internal body conditions that are parallel to and change with changes in their environment. So conformers conform to their environment. They're going to have internal conditions that are similar to their environments and that change when their environmental conditions change too. That's a conformer. You're conforming to what your environment is doing. This means that for conforming organisms, their survival and where they can occur in an ecosystem depend on their tolerances for certain conditions. They cannot, because their body changes with their environment, they'll be excluded from places that are too hot or too cold, that are too acidic or too basic. Okay. Their minimum maximums set where they can live. This form of a lifestyle is inexpensive when it comes to energy and nutrients and organic matter. If you're not spending energy trying to maintain body temperature, you can do something else with that energy. You need less energy. That's a big advantage. The cost to that, not spending energy on maintaining homeostasis and letting your environment dictate it, means that you tend to have a reduced activity and less growth and higher mortality at the extremes of your tolerance range. It means that you have a sweet spot of where you do best in terms of environmental conditions. And when you're there, everything's great. But the minute you move out of that perfect conditions, you start to do worse. And there's not really anything you can do about it, okay? As an animal, you might move physically to a place that meets your conditions better. And we see that as one of the adaptations in conformers all the time, that they migrate on different scales in order to maintain body temperature, moisture levels, to move through low nutrient conditions. In the case of our lizard that we have here, as the air temperature kind of changes, we see that they can be either inactive or active, and that if they're active, they're going to be maintaining a certain body temperature, even though the air temperature changes, and that costs them energy to do so. If this lizard is in an inactive state, its body temperature really conforms to that of whatever its environment is. And it does best where it doesn't have to spend a lot of energy when it's active, maintaining body temperature. And when it's in these types of conditions, it either has to spend a lot of energy or goes into some form of inactivity, of hibernation, or torpor, where it just kind of sits there. And it's not able to do as much. So conformers are going to be our ectothermic organisms, our cultural terms. They're going to be our cold-blooded organisms when it comes to temperature, that they change body temperature with their environment. Okay, so it's not costly, but it really limits what you can do. It's like a shade-tolerant plant. You can do well in certain conditions, but you're going to do poorly in others. Okay, a regulator then is the flip side scenario. And a regulator is when your internal body conditions are constant despite changes in the environment. Okay, it can get hotter or colder outside, you will have the same body temperature. Okay, your body temperature will not change as your environment does. This means that the survival and occurrence of regulatory organisms depends on their ability to regulate. If they're really good at it and they have lots of adaptations, they can exist in a lot of different scenarios, but sometimes they have small body size, which increases your kind of loss in interaction with your environment because you have more surface area. You might be really kind of limited and you might spend a lot of energy maintaining homeostasis. All regulators have a big problem that this is very energetically and biochemically expensive. They spend a lot of energy and nutrient uptake maintaining conditions as they want them to be. They grow slower, they have to eat more, they have higher metabolic needs and metabolic rates. But they can live anywhere and do anything as long as they can feed their metabolic needs. And so for them, it's the flip side in terms of cost and benefits from a conformer. It's expensive, but it means that the environment can go through big radical shifts and they'll still be at their optimal growth rate and be able to survive. In our little scenarios here, regulators have a constant internal body condition regardless of what the environment is doing. If you're a conformer, you have the same body condition as your external environment. The way I want to demonstrate this a little bit is just to talk about moisture availability and adaptations that we see in different animals. And so we talked about some moisture adaptations in plants. One of the challenges that terrestrial animals have to face is the same thing. They have to have access to water. And so they meet it in different ways.
Plants are they regulators then? They even count on the spectrum?
No, I would say plants are conformers.
Conformers?
And that they have almost no ability to moderate body temperature in relation to their environment. When their environment heats up, they heat up. They can do things with evaporation rate, and they can do things with surface area and leaf curling and wilting and dropping leaves to help moderate that. But their ability to withstand a certain temperature and moisture range is what sets them in an environment. They can't really regulate across big changes in temperature and moisture. So they're conformers. Okay, so in terms of terrestrial organisms, water loss to evaporation and waste production is a real problem. And they balance that, of course, they drink water, but they eat stuff that has water in it that can add to the water in their diet. Lots of organisms will excrete salt through salt glands, very particularly if you're an osmoregulator in a saltwater environment. You have a salt gland that expels salt. If you've ever watched the Planet Earth videos again, actually, or the Blue Planet videos of the Galapagos Island iguanas, they're like sneezing all the time, and there's this like spray that comes up. That's them expelling excess salt that they've taken in their diet and in their drinking through a salt gland in their nose. In terms of lots of our reptiles and amphibians, they actually have the cloaca at the end of their digestive system. It's where they excrete their waste. And this region actually holds waste and allows them to reabsorb a ton of moisture before they expel it as waste. And so these organisms don't really produce urine. They produce watery feces because everything mixes together and they get a chance to reabsorb water. In us, that's what our kidney does, okay? Your kidney is the system of infolded membranes with a huge surface area that lets you excrete ions into your waste and reabsorb water. All right. In arid regions, severe water loss can be a real problem. So again, we're talking about desert conditions or places that experience seasonal drought as a regularity. Some organisms are adapted to tolerate low moisture conditions. So 27% of the body weight of a camel is water. Okay, like, dude, that's enormous. And in terms of rabbits, up to 50% of their body weight can be water. And so they can store water to help them tolerate low water conditions. In the case of lots of different types of herbivores, they migrate as water availability changes. They follow the greening of the plains and prairies as waterfall increases so that they have food and water that's available to them. They migrate and move around from water hole to water hole in order to gain access to water. In terms of amphibians, like our little frog here, they will estivate. They will go into a period of dormancy when they essentially shut down metabolism and growth and reproduction in order to be able to conserve water. And this is the case of lots of our kind of desert and prairie amphibians, like these big African toads. As soon as it rains, they like all pop out of the soil and run around and reproduce, and then they go back into estivation, dig their little burrow, and they will not appear again until it rains. Yeah.
Like when I was in India, like when during monsoon season.
Yeah.
Like like every time out of my house, I see like frogs and like a lot of
Yes.
insects, like just like in a whole bunch of colony of insects just there.
It's this. It's a moisture adaptation. They go into dormancy or hibernation essentially when there's lack of water. And the minute they get enough water, it reboots their metabolism and they start going again. And they go all out. Like crazy. In insects, we call the same type of thing dipause. And in insects, very often we'll see that they get stuck in a particular larval phase or intermediary phase before they reach sexual maturity in order to conserve resources for when conditions are right. And again, that's usually related to moisture. And in lots of mammals and reptiles, we see that they're active at night so they can avoid the heat stress and the water loss of the day.
I think I just got the name of that show, Arrested Development.
Oh,
It's like, never heard of that show?
oh yeah, there's
It's
lots.
just like there's a
The name,
man
like-
town walking around
Yeah, the
on
name.
stage.
There's always money in the banana stand.
Yeah.
That's what works. Yeah. Okay. I think that's where I'm gonna leave it here. It's about 1:40. We're gonna meet at the Nature Center tomorrow. I will amend the study guide that's online so that we don't cover stuff that we haven't talked about. So I won't ask you anything about osmoregulators and conformers. I won't ask you anything about thermoregulation in animals, this poikilotherm, homeotherm, endotherm, ectotherm thing. We'll pick that up as we talk about different topics.
Is it next Thursday?
Next Tuesday is our exam. Tuesday, October 1st.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks guys.